They were given sealed metal cans with their meal, and several prisoners turned them in their hands instead of opening them immediately, because in their experience, canned food was something kept for shortages, storms, or military reserves, not for an ordinary lunch. And as they watched Americans open similar cans without hesitation, a quiet question formed among them, wondering why anyone would use emergency food on a normal day. The first time canned food appeared regularly in the camp dining hall, it arrived without any announcement, simply placed on the serving tables alongside bread and hot dishes, and the prisoners noticed it immediately because the small metal containers were different from the fresh or cooked foods they expected, and several men picked them up, turning them slowly to read the printed labels, which many could not fully understand. Yet the bright designs and clear factory markings showed that the food came from large-scale production rather than from a local kitchen. In Germany before the war, preserved foods existed but were not part of daily civilian meals for most families, since many people relied on markets, gardens, and fresh preparation, and tins were often associated with long travel, naval supply, or emergency storage. So seeing them served casually created quiet confusion, not fear, but a careful curiosity about how Americans viewed food supply and storage. At the tables, an American worker demonstrated how to use a simple opener fixed to the counter, pressing the metal wheel against the lid and turning it smoothly until the top lifted away. And this small action drew attention because it showed that opening a can here required no special effort or ration control, only routine practice. And once opened, the contents revealed vegetables, meats, or fruit packed neatly in liquid, looking uniform and predictable compared to the varied appearance of freshly cooked meals. Some prisoners smelled the contents first, checking for signs of spoilage out of habit learned during wartime scarcity. Yet the food smelled normal and clean, and when a few men tasted it, they found the flavor mild but consistent, which reflected industrial preparation rather than home cooking, and this consistency itself became part of the lesson because it showed how food systems could aim for reliability over variety. The guards and kitchen staff treated these cans as ordinary supplies, stacking them in storage rooms and bringing them out according to meal plans. And their calm handling signaled that this was not reserve stock but part of standard provisioning. And over several days, the prisoners observed that canned items appeared alongside fresh bread, soups, and occasionally fresh produce, meaning the cans were not replacing normal food but complementing it. This pattern led some prisoners to reconsider their assumptions, since the steady presence of canned goods suggested a supply chain built for stability, where preserved food reduced risk of spoilage and allowed planning beyond local harvest cycles. And for men who had experienced shortages, this reliability stood out as a practical system rather than a luxury. Conversations at the tables shifted from suspicion to comparison, as men discussed how different regions prepared and stored food, and some older prisoners recalled seeing canned goods in ports or on trains before the war, connecting those memories to what they now saw daily. And these exchanges helped turn an unfamiliar object into a topic of learning rather than worry. No speeches were given about it, and no one framed it as a lesson. Yet the simple act of serving canned food as part of an ordinary meal quietly demonstrated how another country organized its resources, and the prisoners, attentive to details that shaped daily life, noted this difference carefully, because understanding routines helped them understand the environment they were living in. By the end of that first week, the cans no longer drew long stares. Yet they still carried meaning as a symbol of a system built on storage, transport, and planning. And for the men observing their surroundings closely, even a small metal container could reveal how a society prepared for uncertainty without waiting for a crisis to justify its use. As the weeks continued, canned food did not disappear after a single introduction, but returned on different days and in different forms, sometimes containing beans, sometimes meat, sometimes fruit and syrup, and this repetition allowed the prisoners to observe patterns rather than isolated moments, because they could now compare how often these items appeared and how they were integrated into meal planning. And the regularity suggested organization rather than improvisation. The camp kitchen followed schedules posted on boards near the serving area, and although the menus were simple, they showed rotation between fresh cooking and preserved items, which revealed that canned goods were part of logistical planning, used to maintain steady supply even when fresh deliveries varied. And this predictability itself felt unusual to men who had known periods when meals depended on availability rather than schedule. Some prisoners began watching how the storage rooms were managed, noticing shelves lined with identical tins arranged by type and date, and they understood that this system allowed the kitchen to track usage and avoid waste, which reflected a broader approach to provisioning where surplus was controlled rather than consumed all at once. And this method reduced the risk of sudden shortages. During work details near supply areas, a few men saw crates arriving with printed markings from American food companies, showing brand names and factory locations. And these markings indicated a nationwide network of production and distribution, which contrasted with the more localized food systems many prisoners had known. And this scale hinted at industrial capacity supporting daily life far from the front lines. At meals, reactions varied quietly, since some men preferred the dependable taste while others still favored freshly cooked dishes. Yet even those who preferred fresh food acknowledged that the canned portions were filling and safe, and safety mattered because no one wanted illness in a confined environment. So reliability became a practical advantage rather than a novelty. The medical staff in the camp also valued preserved foods because they could ensure consistent nutrition, and this mattered for maintaining health among large groups, especially when diets needed balance. And canned fruits and vegetables contributed vitamins that might otherwise be irregular, which showed that preservation could support planning beyond mere storage. Conversations among prisoners gradually shifted from questioning why canned food was served to discussing how such systems could function in their own towns, and some wondered whether similar methods might spread after the war, since they had seen firsthand how preservation allowed distance between production and consumption without immediate spoilage. No one presented these ideas as lessons in economics or policy, yet the daily exposure to organized supply quietly demonstrated how infrastructure shapes routine, and the prisoners, attentive observers by necessity, learned to read these signs because understanding systems helped them predict their environment. By observing deliveries, storage, and serving patterns, the men built a clearer picture of how preserved food fit into a larger network. And this understanding replaced earlier assumptions that cans were only for crisis, showing instead that they could be tools for stability. And this realization came not from explanation, but from repeated, ordinary experience that gradually clarified how another society managed its resources. As the presence of canned food became familiar, the prisoners began paying attention not only to how often it appeared, but to what it contained, because the contents revealed how preservation worked in practice. And many noticed that vegetables kept their shape, fruits held their color, and meats remained packed in broth or fat that protected them from air. And this visible method of sealing food away from spoilage showed a level of control over storage that differed from traditional home preservation they had known, where jars, smoking, or salting required constant care and were often seasonal. Some prisoners had experience with farming or food preparation before the war, and these men understood that canning required heat, sealing, and clean handling to prevent contamination, and seeing identical results across many cans suggested factory processes designed for uniform safety. And this uniformity built quiet trust, because predictable results reduce hesitation when food quality matters. They also noticed that labels sometimes listed ingredients or origins, and even when language barriers limited full understanding, the printed information itself showed transparency in production, since packaged goods often carried details meant for consumers, and this indicated that such foods were made for the general public, not only for military reserves. During meals, the prisoners compared textures and flavors, recognizing that canned foods tasted different from fresh but remained consistent from one serving to another. And this consistency reflected standardized preparation rather than local variation, and standardized preparation suits large populations where reliability matters more than individual taste. A few men recalled seeing canned goods in port cities or on long train routes before the war, where preserved foods supported travel without kitchens, and connecting those memories to daily camp meals helped them understand that canning served mobility and storage needs beyond emergencies, fitting modern transport systems where food moved long distances. They also observed that canned items reduced preparation time for the kitchen staff, since the contents were already cleaned and portioned, and this efficiency allowed meals to be served on schedule, and schedule mattered in camps where large groups had to move through dining areas in order. No one treated the cans as special, and the staff handled them with the same routine as bread or soup, which reinforced that they were normal supplies. And when something is handled routinely, it signals integration into daily planning rather than rare use. Some prisoners quietly noted that preserved foods allowed supply even when weather or transport delays affected fresh deliveries. And this reliability linked food security to infrastructure rather than to luck, and infrastructure often determines stability more than intention. By this stage, the men no longer viewed canned food as emergency stock, but as part of a broader system designed to maintain steady nutrition across distance and time. And this understanding came from observation rather than instruction, built through repeated exposure to how the food looked, tasted, and arrived. In this way, the simple act of opening it can become a small lesson in how industry, transport, and preservation work together, showing that food could be planned months ahead and still reach a table in usable form. And for prisoners learning about their surroundings through daily details, even a sealed container could quietly explain how another society organized its resources. As canned food continued to appear without interruption, the prisoners gradually stopped treating it as something unusual and started viewing it as part of the camp's normal supply rhythm. Because repetition builds familiarity, and familiarity reduces the need for constant evaluation. And once the men saw that the cans arrived steadily, were opened safely, and caused no problems, their attention shifted from questioning the food itself to understanding how it fit into the larger routine of camp life. They noticed that canned items often appeared on days when fresh deliveries were smaller or delayed, which suggested that the kitchen used preserved food to balance supply rather than to replace fresh meals entirely. And this balancing showed planning, since planning requires knowing what can last and what must be used quickly. And the presence of both fresh and preserved foods revealed a system designed to avoid gaps rather than react to them. Some prisoners assigned to kitchen or cleaning duties observe how leftovers were handled, seeing that unopened cans remained sealed for future use, while open ones were finished the same day. And this careful handling indicated rules meant to maintain hygiene and reduce waste. And such rules are typical in large institutions where health risks must be controlled. They also realized that canned food allowed meals to remain consistent in portion size, because each container held measured amounts, and measured amounts help kitchens serve many people fairly, and fairness in food distribution reduces tension, which administrators value in crowded environments. The labels on the cans sometimes changed by brand or origin, showing that supplies came from multiple producers, and this variety pointed to a broad commercial network supporting deliveries, and broad networks usually indicate strong domestic production capacity, since no single source could supply every facility alone. Conversations among the prisoners became more practical, focusing on which canned items tasted best or paired well with bread, And this shift in topic showed that the food had moved from curiosity to preference, and preference only develops after acceptance, which marked another step in adaptation. The guards and staff continued their neutral approach, never presenting canned food as special or temporary, and this neutrality reinforced that the cans were part of standard provisioning. And when providers treat something as routine, it usually is. For the prisoners, the steady use of preserved food did not change their confinement. Yet it added predictability to meals, and predictability supports mental stability, because knowing what to expect tomorrow reduces small anxieties about scarcity. By this point, the cans no longer symbolized emergency reserves, but represented planning and storage. And this new meaning came from watching how they were used rather than from any explanation. In this steady transition, canned food illustrated how systems built on preservation and transport can support daily life without drama, and how ordinary objects reveal the priorities of the society that produces them, showing that stability often depends on preparation made long before a meal reaches the table. As the months passed and canned food remained a steady part of certain meals, some prisoners began to think less about the cans themselves and more about what they revealed regarding how food moved across a large country. Because every sealed container on a tray represented a chain of farming, processing, packing, and transport that had to function reliably. And for men who had lived through disrupted rail lines and damaged infrastructure in Europe, the idea that food could travel long distances and still arrive usable suggested a level of domestic stability that was difficult to ignore. They understood that canning allowed harvests to be preserved far beyond their natural season, which meant crops picked months earlier could still appear at a table later in the year, and this separation between harvest time and consumption time showed how technology could stretch the usefulness of food, reducing dependence on immediate local supply. And this concept was practical rather than impressive, because it explained how large populations could be fed consistently. Some prisoners who had worked in transport before the war imagined the routes such goods might take, from farms to factories, from factories to rail depots, and from depots to camps. And thinking in these terms helped them see the cans not as isolated items, but as the final step in a coordinated system. And coordinated systems tend to create predictability, which they were experiencing firsthand. They also recognized that preserved foods reduce the risk of spoilage in warm weather, which mattered when feeding many people at once, since illness from bad food could spread quickly in confined settings. And safe storage, therefore, served health as much as convenience. And institutions managing large groups often prioritize such safety measures. For the prisoners themselves, canned food did not change the limits placed on them and did not represent comfort. It contributed to regular meals that arrived on time, and timely meals structure the day. And structured days are easier to navigate mentally than uncertain ones, especially in captivity. Some later recalled that what stayed in memory was not the taste, but the reliability, because reliability contrasts strongly with scarcity. And after years where availability could shift suddenly, steady supply stood out quietly. Still, the men remained realistic, understanding that the goal of camp provisioning was order and nutrition rather than generosity, and viewing the system in practical terms helped them keep balanced expectations. Over time, the cans became just another familiar object on the table, yet they quietly represented how planning and preservation support daily life. And this representation came from observation rather than explanation. By this stage, the prisoners no longer associated canned food with emergencies, but with routine supply. And this change in perception marked the completion of their adjustment, showing how repeated exposure and logical interpretation can reshape assumptions. In this way, a simple medal can become a small window into how industry, agriculture, and transport work together, demonstrating that even during wartime, organized systems could maintain steady provision, and for the men observing their surroundings carefully. These small details help build a clearer understanding of the world beyond the camp fence. In the end, the canned food did not change their situation, did not soften captivity, and did not carry any hidden message. It remained one of those small details where expectation met a different reality. Because many of the men had linked preserved food with crisis and scarcity. And instead, they encountered a system where preservation was part of normal planning, used to maintain steady supply rather than to signal danger. What began as quiet doubt slowly turned into practical understanding, as repeated exposure showed that canning allowed food to travel across time and distance without immediate spoilage. And this realization replaced assumption with context, and context helped the prisoners interpret their surroundings calmly, since logical explanations reduce uncertainty more effectively than speculation. For them, the lesson was not about taste, but about perspective, because everyday habits differ across societies, and those habits often reflect technology, infrastructure, and scale of production more than intention. And seeing this firsthand offered a clearer picture of how another country organized its resources during wartime. Over time, the cans blended into the background of camp life. Yet the memory of their first reaction sometimes remained, because first impressions tend to anchor memory, especially when they involve basic needs like food. Many visible traces of POW life faded after the war, but memories of daily routines lasted longer, and small moments like these shaped how former prisoners later described captivity, not only through fences and regulations, but through ordinary details that revealed cultural contrast. And so the story of the simple metal can settles as a modest example of how adaptation works, showing that even in confinement people continue to observe, compare, and learn, and that history is often experienced through daily encounters as much as through major events, with an ordinary meal quietly illustrating how preparation and planning shape life during time of war. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.